The second hand moved like it was being dragged. Not stopped, not broken, just reluctant, catching, then slipping forward again, as if the face of the clock had grown heavy overnight. Each click landed with a small violence in the quiet, the sound too sharp for a room that had decided to hold its breath. Someone had opened a window early. The air carried in the thin scrape of distant metal and the soft, tired chatter of an engine that refused to fully die. There was a smell underneath everything: warm dust, ink, the sour edge of old coffee abandoned in a cup. The kind of smell that didn't belong to a single person, but to a place that had been used too many hours in a row. A paper cup was turned in slow circles between two fingers. The rim squeaked faintly. Stop. Turn. Stop. Turn. The motion didn't seem to have a purpose beyond proving that the hand still obeyed. Every few rotations, the thumb would press the softened cardboard, as if testing whether it was real. Somewhere near the door, a boot heel tapped once, then twice, then went still, as if the person wearing it had remembered the sound carried. A stack of forms sat slightly misaligned on a table. One sheet slid a fraction of an inch, pushed by the subtle breathing of the... It should have fallen. It didn't. It clung there stubbornly, corner lifted, holding on like a thought you couldn't shake. A pencil rolled, stopped against the wood, rolled again as if the table wasn't level. Someone caught it before it could hit the floor, pinning it with 2 fingers. The graphite left a faint gray bruise on the skin. The lights were on, but not all the way. They hummed, barely audible at first, then impossible to ignore once you noticed. A small, constant vibration in the skull. The kind that made you want to blink hard, rub your eyes, do anything to break the feeling that you were watching the world through glass. A sheet of paper was read, then read again, not because the words changed, because the mind refused to accept them as final. The reader's lips moved without sound. A line was traced with a fingertip, the same line, each time, as if repetition could smooth out its meaning, make it harmless. The finger paused at a certain phrase, then drifted away, then returned and paused again. Someone cleared their throat quietly, then seemed to regret it, swallowing the rest of whatever they might have said. The silence snapped back into place immediately, tighter than before, like fabric pulled over a frame. On a desk, a telephone sat with its receiver perfectly aligned. It looked deliberate, ceremonial even. The cord coiled like a sleeping snake. No one touched it, but every pair of eyes seemed to visit it in turn, briefly, and then move away as though the glance itself was a kind of answer. A chair creaked, not from someone shifting, but from the slow settling of weight that had been there too long. In the distance, beyond walls, beyond corridors, beyond whatever this room was supposed to be, there came a short, clipped sound, a door closing, a latch, then footsteps, moving quickly, then slowing, then stopping, a pause, then footsteps again, as if someone had changed their mind mid-stride. The clock continued its stubborn work. Click, click. The cup turned again. The paper was smoothed again. A crease pressed flat, as if neatness could keep the world orderly. A sleeve was tugged down to cover a wrist. A collar adjusted. Small corrections, small preparations. The body doing what it could when the mind had nowhere to put itself. There was a rustle, a hand reaching for a file, then stopping halfway, fingers hovering over the tab. The hand withdrew without taking it. The file remained untouched, waiting like an accusation. A breath went, held a beat too long, then released slowly through the nose. The air felt thick now, not hot, not cold, just full, crowded with unsaid words, with assumptions that had been repeated so often they had hardened into certainty. There was a particular kind of calm in it, a calm that came from believing the moment to act was still somewhere ahead, that there would be warning enough, that someone would stand up, interrupt the room, change the rhythm of the seconds. Another sound arrived, a thin vibration from far away, the kind you felt more than heard. It lasted only a moment, then vanished, leaving the silence sharper by contrast. No one reacted, or everyone reacted, but only inside, eyes flicking up, a shoulder tightening, a hand freezing mid-motion. Then, as if by agreement, the routine resumed. The cup turned, the pencil was pinned, the paper was read again. The telephone remained untouched. Click, click. The second hand dragged itself forward, carrying the room with it, and somewhere beyond these walls, a minute ended without anyone noticing that it was one they would never get back. Because the minutes everyone believed they still had time were already running out. The corridor outside the room had its own weather. Air moved through it in thin, purposeful currents, cold sliding along the floor, warmer breath drifting down from somewhere higher, the 2 layers refusing to mix. The light was the color of paper left too long in a drawer. It didn't brighten so much as reveal. Scuffed boots at the baseboards, cigarette ash ground into seams, fingerprints on painted metal where hands had braced themselves 1,000 times. A man stood with his back to the wall, not leaning, just close enough to feel the plaster through his uniform. He held a clipboard the way some people held prayer books, flat against the chest, fingers locked around the edge. Every few seconds he glanced at the corridor clock, then away before the glance could become an admission. Down the hall, a kettle whistled, and then stopped abruptly, as if someone had clapped a hand over its mouth. The smell of boiled water followed, clean and honest, briefly washing over the stale undertones of oil and sweat. Somewhere, a cup clinked against a saucer. Someone poured and poured, not looking at the level, because watching the dark liquid rise would mean noticing how little there was to do but wait. Doors stood half open like mouths that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Inside one of them, a typist sat at a desk with her sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her fingers moved in short bursts, rapid, certain, then halted for a long moment with the keys depressed, like a pianist caught at the edge of a wrong note. She tore a sheet free, fed in another, started again. The machine spoke in staccato, then fell silent. Each time it stopped, the quiet seemed to swell, eager to fill the gap. A runner passed in the corridor, not running, never running, just walking fast enough that the papers under his arm fluttered. He kept his gaze straight ahead. He did not look into any doorway, as if eye contact might recruit him into a conversation he could not afford. The building was awake, but pretending otherwise. There was a rhythm to it. Steps, pause, steps, pause. The soft scrape of chairs, the dull thunk of a stamp against ink, the rasp of a match being struck. Somewhere a radio murmured at low volume, the voice carefully balanced between audible and ignorable. Every now and then the voice rose, an announcer shifting tone, then was turned down again before it could demand attention. In a larger room at the end of the corridor, men hovered over maps laid flat on tables. Their hands were clean, but their nails were dark with graphite. They spoke in numbers and place names that were meant to sound ordinary. Grid references, timings, routes, words that belonged to routine, to planning, to the familiar comfort of procedure. One man traced a line along a coastline with the back of a pencil, not the point. Another watched the pencil's shadow rather than the line itself, as if the shadow was more honest. A third checked his watch, then checked the wall clock, then checked his watch again, as if one of them might decide to tell a different story. Still time, someone said quietly, not as reassurance but as a habit, like clearing the throat. No one challenged it. The phrase lived here. It had lived here for days, maybe longer, passed from mouth to mouth until it felt like policy. A clerk entered with a folder held close. He waited at the edge of the map table until someone noticed him. When they finally did, it was with a nod so slight it could have been mistaken for a twitch. The clerk placed the folder down carefully, aligned it with the table's edge, and retreated without turning his back. The ritual mattered. It preserved the shape of control. The folder remained closed. A man with a tired face and an immaculate collar stood by a window that didn't open. He watched the courtyard below as if it were a theater between acts. Vehicles came and went with the same dull discipline. Stop, idle, move. Men loaded crates. Men unloaded crates. The crates looked identical, wooden rectangles, stamped with ink that had begun to blur. The work was steady, almost calming, the sort of labor that suggested the world still made sense. A cigarette burned down in an ashtray beside the window, forgotten. The smoke curled in slow, elegant spirals. It had all the time in the world. Someone laughed softly in the courtyard, a brief sound that didn't belong. The laugh died quickly, as if strangled by the air. The man at the window didn't react. His eyes stayed on the movement below, on the orderly choreography. He let the cigarette burn itself into a long, fragile column of ash. In another room, a young officer practiced his signature, not because he enjoyed it, because the pen kept the hand occupied, because a name written cleanly on paper was proof of calm. He signed once, then again, the same loop, the same slant. He studied the ink like it was evidence of his own steadiness. A senior man walked past his desk and paused. He didn't comment on the signature. He merely placed 2 fingers on the desk's edge, feeling the vibration of the building through the wood. Then, he moved on. The young officer exhaled slowly and resumed writing as if nothing had. Elsewhere, someone adjusted a belt, straightened a stack of telegram forms, tightened a strap. Small acts of order, performed with devotion. It was as if everyone had agreed. Keep the hands busy, and the mind will follow. In the corridor, the man with the clipboard shifted his weight for the first time in minutes. The rubber sole of his boot squeaked faintly on the polished floor. He froze, listening to the sound of his own movement with mild disgust. He set his heel down again, more carefully this time. A door opened and closed down the hall. Voices emerged briefly, 2 men speaking in low tones. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was familiar. Questions asked gently, answers given with too much certainty. Then the door shut, and the corridor returned to its controlled emptiness. The wall clock ticked on, its hands moved without hesitation, indifferent to the careful pace of the people beneath it. A message arrived at the front desk. The man receiving it read it twice and smiled in a way that looked like relief until you saw it didn't reach his eyes. He folded the paper once, then again, crisp creases, and set it beside a cup of cooling tea. He didn't deliver it immediately, not because he was careless, because there was a proper moment for it, a proper path through the building, a proper order of it. He waited for the right gap in the day's rhythm. He waited because that was what everyone did here, waited for the moment that would make the next moment safe. In the map room, a hand finally lifted the folder's cover. Paper whispered against paper. Someone's breath caught, not a gasp, just a faint hitch. The room did not change. No one stood. No one raised their voice. The men leaned in the slightest fraction, as if drawn forward by gravity rather than curiosity. Minor, someone said after a moment, as if the word could seal the edges of the page. Nothing, someone else added, almost automatically. The folder was closed again with care. And just like that, the building returned to its chosen calm, its routines, its neat stacks, its quiet assurances, holding on to the belief that the day was still theirs to shape. Outside, a vehicle backfired in the street and then moved on. Inside, nobody looked up. And somewhere in the unseen spaces between decisions and consequences, the minutes kept thinning, one by one, like paper held too close to flame. The first sign arrived disguised as a correction. A runner appeared at the edge of the map room carrying a single slip of paper, smaller than the folders, smaller even than the routine reports. He did not interrupt. He waited until a sentence ended, until a pencil stopped moving. Then he stepped forward and placed the slip beside the larger documents, careful not to overlap them, as if hierarchy could be preserved by placement alone. No one asked where it came from. A man read it once. His eyes moved quickly, efficiently. He nodded, once, and passed it to the left. The paper made a quiet sound as it traveled, skin to skin, nail to nail, before settling near the center of the table. Someone weighed it down with a coffee cup to keep it from curling. Probably a timing issue, the first man said, already turning back to them. No one disagreed. The phrase fit easily into the room, like furniture that had always been there. In another wing of the building, a switchboard operator adjusted her headset and frowned. A connection crackled, dropped, returned with a delay that hadn't been there earlier. She tested the line again, tapping a finger against the console in a steady rhythm. "Line's a little slow," she murmured to no one in particular. Her supervisor passed behind her and paused just long enough to glance at the board. Lights blinked. Nothing was dark. Nothing was fully wrong. "It happens," he said, already moving on. She nodded and logged it neatly in a ledger, the ink still wet when the next call came. In the courtyard, a driver waited beside his vehicle longer than expected. The engine idled unevenly, coughing once before settling into a lower pitch. He leaned against the hood and lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with his palm. He glanced toward the building's windows, searching for a signal that never came. When the cigarette burned down, he flicked it away and climbed back inside. The engine started again on the second try. A guard at the outer gate adjusted his cap and squinted down the road. Traffic moved as scheduled, but the spacing felt off. Too much distance between vehicles, like a sentence with extra commas. He checked his watch, then the printed timetable tucked into his pocket. He said nothing. Inside, a clerk noticed that one of the forms had been printed with the wrong date, just one digit out of place. He corrected it by hand, carefully, so the correction looked intentional rather than rushed. The stack went back into circulation without comment. On a stairwell landing, two men crossed paths and hesitated, each waiting for the other to speak first. One finally asked a question that had already been answered earlier that morning. "Still on schedule?" The other smiled. "Of course." They continued on, their footsteps separating, the moment dissolving as if it had never existed. The radio in the background shifted frequencies for a second, just a breath of static, before the voice returned, smoother than before. The announcer repeated a line he had already said, not because it was important, but because repetition was safer than silence. In the map room, a pencil snapped. The sound was sharp, out of place. Every head lifted for a fraction of a second. The man holding the pencil stared at the broken tip, as if surprised by its betrayal. He replaced it with another from a tin, and resumed tracing routes without apology. "Quality's been slipping," someone said lightly. A ripple of quiet acknowledgement followed. The maps did not change. A junior officer entered, carrying a message, and stopped just inside the doorway. He cleared his throat once, then again, softer this time. When no one looked up, he stepped closer. "This just came in," he said. A hand gestured without turning. The officer placed the message down and retreated, his shoulders tight. The paper lay there unclaimed for a long moment before someone reached for it. The message contained a discrepancy. Small, technical, almost elegant in its simplicity. Numbers that didn't quite line up. A margin that felt too narrow. "It'll resolve," someone said, not unkindly. "They always do." The message was folded and set aside. In an office nearby, a man stared at a calendar pinned to the wall. He had circled today's date earlier in the week, then crossed the circle out and drawn it again darker, thicker, as if emphasis could reinforce certainty. Now he studied it, counting backward under his breath, then forward again. He adjusted the calendar slightly so it hung straighter. A telephone rang in a side room, and rang longer than usual before being answered. The voice on the other end spoke quickly, too quickly. The listener nodded, murmuring assent even when the words became unclear. When the call ended, he sat for a moment with the receiver still in his hand, listening to the empty hum. He placed it back carefully and wrote a note summarizing the conversation. He omitted the hesitation. In the corridor, the man with the clipboard had shifted positions 3 times now, each move justified by some small discomfort. He had begun to notice the sound of the building itself, the way the pipes ticked, the way the walls seemed to breathe. He checked the time again. A door opened somewhere above, followed by hurried steps, and then a sudden stop, as if the person had realized they were moving too fast. The steps resumed at a measured pace. In the courtyard, the crates were stacked slightly differently now. One had been turned the wrong way, its markings upside down. A loader noticed, hesitated, then left it. Turning it back would mean admitting the order mattered. The man at the window inside noticed the change below. He frowned, then smoothed his expression. He told himself it was nothing. Across the table, a hand hovered over a particular point on the map longer than necessary. The finger traced a circle once, then lifted away. No one commented on the gesture. "Weather's holding," someone said, glancing toward a chart pinned on the wall. The chart had not been updated in hours. A clerk brought in a fresh batch of papers and set them down. The stack leaned slightly to one side. He straightened it, then straightened it again, then pressed down firmly with both palms until the edges aligned. The effort seemed excessive, but no one mentioned it. Another message arrived, this one delayed, its timestamp earlier than its arrival. The recipient noticed, frowned, then shrugged and filed it under the correct heading anyway. Time, after all, was flexible. In a small break room, a cup of tea sat untouched, a thin film forming on its surface. The person who had poured it stared at the liquid as if expecting it to move. When it didn't, they took a sip and winced at the taste. "It's gone cold," they said. "So reheat it," someone replied. They didn't. Back in the map room, the clock on the wall chimed the hour. The sound was gentle, almost polite. Conversations paused, then resumed immediately, voices overlapping slightly before settling back into order. Someone remarked on how quickly the morning had. No one answered. A junior man noticed that the clock in the corridor was 2 minutes behind the one in the map room. He considered mentioning it, even opened his mouth, then closed it again. The discrepancy felt trivial, embarrassing even. He told himself it would be corrected later. Outside, clouds shifted, revealing a strip of pale sky. The light changed just enough to alter the color of the courtyard, turning gray into something thinner, more uncertain. Inside, routines continued. Papers moved. Messages were filed. Assurances were repeated. Each small irregularity was absorbed, smoothed over, explained away by habit and confidence. Each sign bent gently under the weight of expectation until it no longer looked like a warning at all. And beneath it all, unnoticed and unremarked, the margin for correction narrowed, quietly, precisely, while everyone carried on as if the space between now and later were still wide enough to matter. The day began to shed its excess. Not abruptly, not enough to alarm anyone, just a subtle tightening, like fabric drawn a notch closer around the ribs. A watch was checked and then checked again, not because it disagreed with the clocks, but because the act of checking had become reflex. Time no longer felt like a background condition. It had weight now, presence. In the map room, voices lowered without instruction. The men still spoke, still exchanged figures and confirmations, but the rhythm had changed. Sentences ended sooner. Pauses stretched longer. Each silence waited to see if it would be filled. A chair scraped as someone leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. The movement displaced a ruler, which slid a few inches before stopping against a folded document. No one reached to put it back. The ruler remained there, slightly out of place, marking nothing. A courier arrived breathless, not from running, but from having moved too carefully for too long. He stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to announce himself or wait to be noticed. When he finally spoke, his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Update," he said. The word hovered. It was not an emergency, not yet, but it was not routine either. A hand gestured. The update was delivered, read, reread. Someone inhaled through the nose. Slowly. "This narrows it," a man said, choosing his words with care. "Temporarily," another replied, too quickly. They both nodded, as if agreement had been reached. In the corridor, a senior officer paused mid-stride, sensing, without knowing why, that he had passed the door he was meant to enter. He turned back, hesitated, then continued on. The correction felt unnecessary, even intrusive. A secretary typed a final line and removed the page from the machine. She stared at the blank sheet, waiting to replace it, fingers hovering above the keys. For a moment, she considered starting a new document. Then she stacked the finished page neatly and turned the machine off. The sudden silence startled her. Somewhere deep in the building, a generator shifted load. The lights dimmed imperceptibly, then stabilized. A few people noticed. No one spoke. At the communications desk, the operator leaned closer to her console, listening for the familiar cadence of responses. There was a delay now, brief, but consistent. She adjusted a dial, then another. The delay remained. She wrote it down, underlining the note once, not twice. Once felt appropriate. A man nearby glanced at her log and raised an eyebrow. "Still working," she said, before he could ask. He nodded and walked away. In the courtyard, activity had thinned. Fewer vehicles, longer gaps between moves. A crate was left on a dolly, instead of being stacked immediately. The men responsible stood beside it, hands on hips, waiting for an instruction that did not come. One of them checked his watch and laughed softly. "Plenty of time," he said, to no one in particular. The sound of the laugh felt wrong, even to him. He stopped abruptly and cleared his throat. Back inside, a file was removed from a cabinet and placed on a desk. It had been there before, earlier in the day, but now it seemed heavier. The man opening it did so slowly, as if speed itself might be interpreted as intent. He read, closed it, and left it on the desk instead of returning it to its place. A phone rang in the map room. Conversations halted. All eyes turned, not to the phone, but to the man closest to it. He let it ring twice more before answering. "Yes," he said. He listened. His face did not change. When he spoke again, his voice was even, almost gentle. "Understood." He replaced the receiver and remained standing, hand resting on the phone for a moment longer than necessary. No one asked what the call had been about. Instead, someone remarked on the weather again. Someone else adjusted a chart. Someone else folded their arms and stared at the table, seeing something that wasn't printed there. A decision brushed the edge of the room. Not spoken, not formed, just sensed. Like the pressure change for a storm. In an office down the hall, a man drafted a message he hoped would not be sent. He chose his words carefully, neutral and precise. When he finished, he read it once, then tore the page in half and placed the pieces in the bin. He felt relieved. Briefly, the clocks continued their indifferent work. The discrepancy between them was still there. No one corrected it. The idea of synchronizing them felt suddenly unnecessary, almost futile. Another update arrived. This one was acknowledged with a nod, not a comment. The paper was set aside with the others, forming a small, uneven stack that leaned toward the center of the table, as if drawn inward. A man noticed the lean and straightened the stack. It leaned again as soon as he removed his hand. He left it that way. The building felt quieter now, not because there was less sound, but because every sound seemed to matter. Footsteps were measured. Doors closed softly. Voices stayed low, respectful of something unnamed but present. Time had begun to compress. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to remove excess. There were fewer gestures now, fewer reassurances. The space for reconsideration, once wide and forgiving, had narrowed to something more precise. Still, no one said it. Still, no one acted. They moved instead through the final window with practiced calm, trusting that if something truly urgent existed, it would announce itself loudly. And because it did not, the last moments where a change could still occur passed quietly, unnoticed, like a door closing in a room no one was watching. It happened without ceremony. No one marked the moment. No voice announced it. There was no sound that belonged uniquely to it. Just a small action, completed in the correct order, by the correct person, at the correct time. A form was removed from the top of the stack. The man who took it did so with the ease of habit. He did not look around before lifting it. He did not hesitate. His thumb pressed the corner flat, smoothing a crease that had already been smoothed twice that morning. The paper carried the faint warmth of other hands. He read the header. He did not need to read the rest. He had read it before, in drafts, in discussions, in versions that had promised flexibility. This one looked final, not because it said so, but because nothing on it suggested delay. He reached for a pen. The pen had been placed there earlier, aligned parallel to the table's edge. It rolled slightly when his fingers touched it, then stopped. He adjusted it, straightened it, and only then lifted it from the wood. Across the room, someone glanced up, sensing movement. Their eyes rested on the pen, then drifted away. The sight did not register as danger. It registered as progress. The pen touched paper. The sound was barely audible, a soft, fibrous scratch. The kind of sound that belonged to offices, to administration, to days that ended normally. The signature took longer than, not because of doubt, but because the man was careful. He did not want the ink to smear. He did not want the line to look rushed. He wanted it to look like it had always been meant to be there. When he finished, he lifted the pen and examined the result with quiet satisfaction. "That should do it," he said, not loudly enough to be an announcement. No one responded. The words did not require a response. The form was passed along the table. Each person who touched it did so briefly, confirming, aligning, acknowledging. A stamp was pressed down once. The red ink bloomed and dried almost immediately, absorbed by the paper. A clerk took the document and placed it into a folder. The folder was thinner than most. It closed with a gentle sound, more felt than. The clerk stood, waited for a nod, and then turned toward the door. In the corridor, the air felt different, tighter, as if the building had exhaled and not yet drawn breath again. The clerk walked at a measured pace, resisting the urge to hurry. Running would imply urgency. Urgency would imply something had changed. He delivered the folder to a desk he had visited dozens of times before. The recipient accepted it without comment, slid it into a tray marked with a familiar label, and moved the tray from left to right. The motion was small, almost invisible. But once the tray had been moved, it did not return. Elsewhere, a switch was flipped to a new position. Not with force, not with intention beyond procedure. The operator checked the indicator light. It glowed steadily. She made a note and turned her attention to the next task. A vehicle in the courtyard received a signal and shut its engine off. Another started in response. The handover was smooth, practiced. The men involved exchanged a brief glance, then looked away. Inside, the clocks continued to disagree. No one noticed any. A man in a side office felt an inexplicable tightening in his chest. He stood, walked to the window, and placed his palm against the glass. The courtyard below looked unchanged. He told himself the sensation would pass. It did not. In the map room, the folder was gone from the table. The space where it had been felt larger than it should have been, like a tooth pulled cleanly from the jaw. Someone shifted a ruler into the gap, unconsciously trying to fill it. No one mentioned the absence. A phone rang once in a distant office and was silenced before the second ring could. The person answering spoke briefly, then listened longer than they spoke. When the call ended, they did not write anything down. There was nothing left to record. The man who had signed the form sat back in his chair and folded his hands. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to relax. The decision, if it could even be called that, was complete. The machinery could carry it now. He glanced at the clock and nodded to himself. Still time, he thought. Just not time to change it. In the corridors, doors closed softly, not an alarm, in sequence, one after another, like the settling of locks. Outside, the light shifted again, clouds thickening, thinning, undecided. A breeze stirred dust along the pavement, and then died. Inside, the final threshold had been crossed so quietly that no one could point to when it happened. Only that from this moment forward, everything that followed would arrive whether anyone was ready for it or not. The building fell into a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet that comes after instructions have finished moving, and before consequences begin to arrive. A pause that was not rest. A pause that was waiting to be filled by something already on its way. In the map room, chairs were pushed back slightly, not enough to stand, just enough to change posture. The men remained seated, hands folded, fingers interlaced, palms flat on the table. There was nothing left to adjust. No papers out of place. No margins left to widen. Someone checked the clock out of habit, and felt a faint irritation when it confirmed exactly what they expected. Across the building, conversations tapered off. Not because they were ended, but because they had reached a natural limit. Anything said now would only repeat what had already been agreed upon in silence. A clerk walked down the corridor carrying nothing. He realized halfway through that he had no destination and slowed, embarrassed by his own momentum. He stopped near a window and pretended to look outside, counting the seconds by the movement of people below. In the communications room, the operator removed her headset and set it neatly beside the console. The lines were still open. The lights still blinked. but there was nothing more she could meaningfully listen for. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. A man in a side office began to write a letter, then stopped after the first sentence. He stared at the words until they seemed foreign, then folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer he did not lock. In the courtyard, engines were quiet now. Vehicles stood in place, aligned with practiced precision. Men lingered beside them without speaking, helmets under arms, collars turned up against a breeze that had begun to carry a colder edge. Someone laughed once, softly, and then stopped when no one joined. Inside, doors remained closed. No one opened them, and the movement of the building had slowed to breathing. Slow, deliberate, controlled. A clock chimed the quarter hour. The sound echoed farther than it should have. In the map room, one man cleared his throat and seemed surprised by the noise it made. He lowered his head slightly, as if in apology to the silence. Another reached for a cup of coffee and realized it had gone untouched for too long. He took a sip anyway, and did not react to the taste. No one looked at the maps now. They had done their work. They were just paper again. A sense of waiting settled everywhere at once. Not anxious, not frantic. The kind of waiting that no longer asks questions. Outside, clouds thickened until the light became flat and colorless. The air pressed down gently, insistently. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond hearing, systems had already begun to move in response to a choice that no longer required human attention. Inside the building, the clocks continued their imperfect agreement, marking time that was no longer available for revision. A man glanced at his watch, and then did not look again. Breath slowed, hands stilled. The ordinary world held itself perfectly still, balanced on the edge of what came next. And in those final seconds, those last borrowed moments, nothing happened at all. No one spoke anymore. The silence was not enforced. It arrived naturally, as if conversation itself had reached an agreed conclusion and stepped aside. The building did not feel abandoned. It felt attentive, like a room listening for a sound it already knew was coming. A clock ticked, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to remind the walls that time still existed, even if it no longer belonged to anyone inside them. In the map room, a man adjusted his position in the chair and then stopped halfway through the motion, realizing there was no more comfortable way to sit. He remained slightly forward, elbows near the table, shoulders tense but controlled. Across from him, another man mirrored the posture without noticing. Their reflections in the polished surface of the table looked like statues interrupted mid-thought. A folder lay closed near the edge of the room. It had been placed there deliberately, away from hands, away from eyes. It did not draw attention. It did not need to. Its presence was already somewhere in the building. A ventilation fan clicked off. The air grew heavier by degrees, the stillness settling deeper into corners, into fabric, into breath. People became aware of their own breathing, and then, almost instinctively, softened it. In the communications room, the operator remained seated, gaze fixed on the console without really seeing it. The blinking lights had taken on a strange quality. No longer signals, no longer information, just patterns, familiar, reassuring in their predictability. She counted the blinks without meaning to. In the corridor, a man leaned against the wall and felt the faint vibration running through. Steady, distant, patient. He pressed his palm flatter against the surface, as if he might identify the source through touch alone. Whatever it was, it did not hurry. Outside, the courtyard was nearly motionless. A flag stirred once, then hung limp again. A scrap of paper skittered across the ground and lodged against a tire. No one bent to retrieve it. The sky had lost definition. Clouds blurred into one another until there was no clear boundary between layers. Light existed, but it had thinned to something neutral, undecided. Shadows softened, edges dissolved. Inside, a door creaked faintly as it settled further into its frame. The sound traveled farther than expected. A few heads lifted, then lowered again when nothing followed. A man checked his watch and then turned it inward on his wrist, the face hidden from view. He did not want to keep counting. Counting implied choice. Another man closed his eyes briefly, not in prayer, not in rest, but simply to experience the absence of sight. When he opened them again, the room looked unchanged. That, somehow, unsettled him more than movement would have. Time continued, but it had become abstract, no longer a sequence of moments, but a single stretched interval with no clear edge. The past felt distant, the future felt fixed. Only the present remained thin and taut, holding everything in place. A cup slipped from someone's fingers and was caught before it could fall. The near sound lingered longer than an actual crash would. The cup was set down carefully, deliberately, as if acknowledging how fragile the quiet had become. No one commented. In a side office, a telephone sat untouched. The receiver rested perfectly in its cradle. The cord lay in an orderly coil, undisturbed. The phone did not ring. It did not need to. The men and women inside the building waited, not for information, not for instruction, but for confirmation of what had already been set in motion beyond their reach. No one said the word now. No one said the word too late. The clocks ticked on, each slightly out of step with the others, measuring a time that could no longer be altered. The discrepancy no longer mattered. Synchrony was irrelevant. A faint pressure settled in ears. A subtle change in air, the kind that might have been explained away earlier, catalogued, dismissed. Now it was simply felt. Breaths were drawn and released with care. Hands rested where they were placed. Eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Nothing happened, and yet everything had already begun. The building held itself in perfect stillness, suspended between 1 second and the next, as if the world itself were waiting for permission to move again, permission that would never come.